spring of 51 AD, Paul begins a second journey into the pioneer territory. This is recorded in Acts 15:36 through 18:22. While Paul undoubtedly enjoyed the ministry in Antioch, but it wasn't going to be long until he was ready to make another journey. Now he was concerned about the churches established on the first evangelistic journey. Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord and see how they're doing," in Acts 15:35-36. Paul chose Silas to accompany him. Then they began their journey on foot to their first destination, passing through Syria and Cilicia, encouraging the churches that must have been founded out of the ministry of Paul's earlier ministry out of Tarsus or out of the ministry at Antioch by some of the other disciples. They got to Tarsus, Paul's hometown, in Acts 22:3, a journey of about 7 days walking, plus time to the churches. Paul and Silas walked 7 days again through the Tarsus mountains to Derbe, through the valleys and breaks in the mountain passes. Up to the 3,300-foot interior plateau. After a visit, they trekked another 3 days to Lystra, where they met Timothy, who had already been serving in the regional churches. He was recruited to join their team. During this trip, Paul became sick with a physical disease, according to Galatians 4:13-14, but continued teaching and encouraging the believers. Now 3 of them walked together 2 days on to Iconium. In these towns they had success in strengthening the disciples and making new converts, in Acts 16:1-5. They proceeded another 5 days to Antioch of Pisidia on the border of the province of Asia. And as they departed Antioch, in 2 days they came to a crossroads with 2 choices. And they were led by the Spirit not to go into southwest into Asia now, so they headed north to the border of Bithynia, Acts 16:7, beginning a month-long trek across modern-day Turkey. It was another 9 days' walk north, only to find the Spirit would not let them continue into Bithynia. Their choice now was a long 23-day hazardous mountainous journey to reach the western coastal town of Troas, in Acts 16:8 on the Aegean Sea. Likely some of the events described in 2 Corinthians 11 occurred during this trip, though not mentioned by Luke: beatings, floggings, bandits, etc. In Troas, the team was joined by a medical doctor named Luke, who began to write the story of this evangelistic journey. During the night of their visit in Troas, Paul received a vision of a Macedonian man pleading with Paul to come to help them, Acts 16:9, which Paul took as God's leading. So they immediately got passage on a ship sailing to Samothrace, halfway across the Aegean Sea. They caught a ship then to continue on to the seaport of Neapolis in Macedonia, followed by an 11-mile walk to Philippi, a Roman colony for Roman citizens. In Philippi, there was no synagogue, so the Jews met for prayer on the banks of the Gangites River until they had enough men to start a synagogue. There Paul's team met with them, and they shared the gospel. A businesswoman named Lydia and other members of her household were converted and baptized in the river in Acts 16:13 through 15. One day Paul cast out an evil spirit from a fortune-teller's psychic slave girl, and her owners falsely accused them, so they were thrown into prison, beaten, and put into bonds. Yet they were singing and rejoicing. Acts 16, verses 16 to 24. That night an earthquake occurred, opening the cells, but no prisoner escaped thanks to Paul. As a result, the jailer and all of his family became believers and were baptized late that same night in Acts 16:25 to 34. The next morning they were released from prison with some embarrassment to the authorities, Acts 16:35 to 40, who requested that they leave the city. Passing through Amphipolis, to Apollonia, in a 5-day walk they came to Thessalonica, where Paul taught for 3 weeks. They preached in the synagogue and made converts, but some Jews made trouble in Acts 17:1 through 9. During this stay in Thessalonica, at least twice during the month, some believers from Philippi carried 2 offerings 100 miles to Paul and his team, recorded in Philippians 4:15 to 16. Only Paul and Silas were sent by night to Berea for safety reasons, so Timothy and maybe now Luke stayed a little longer in Thessalonica. Then later they caught up with Paul in Athens. After the 2-day, 44-mile trek to Berea, they found ready minds to receive the gospel, who compared everything with the Old Testament scriptures, according to Acts 17:11. But the troublemakers arrived from Philippi, so Paul fled with some of the brethren on a journey to Athens to avoid them, Acts 17:10 through 15, leaving Silas and Timothy in Berea temporarily, Acts 17:14 through 15. This was possibly during the winter of 51 to 52 AD. The journey from Berea to Athens was about 12 days of walking, or about 240 miles, or maybe 4 days by ship. The men from Berea that escorted Paul returned with a letter for Silas and Timothy to join them in Athens in Acts 17, verse 15. Athens was the home of the goddess Athena and the greatest university of the ancient world. Athens had more idols and images than all of Greece. There was a synagogue with devout Gentiles who listened to Paul's reasoning from scriptures, but his sermon on the Areopagus, a prominent cliff near the Acropolis, before the council of the Court of Justice, was a classic contextualized message. He used the image of the unknown God, according to chapter 17, verse 23. Perhaps because only a few men became followers and believed in 1734, Paul decided to head to Corinth, about a 3-day walk, where he met Aquila and Priscilla, who had fled from the mounting persecution in Rome and were practicing a tent-making profession just as Paul did, according to Acts 18:3. This is the only mention of Paul's secular profession. Paul remained in Corinth for 18 months, the longest residence of his 3 journeys. Corinth was a city of about 600,000, we estimate, and called the ornament of Greece, but was grossly immoral, sometimes referred to as the Sodom and Gomorrah of Greece. It was home of the Temple of Aphrodite on top of the 1,750-foot mountain near Corinth, staffed with 1,000 temple prostitutes, male and female. Here Paul wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians to the churches they had just started a few months before. Once the church was established, it was time for Paul to return to Syria, according to chapter 18, verse 18. So he left the church with his disciples and traveled along with Aquila and Priscilla to Ephesus. They headed toward Cenchrea, the port city of Corinth, where he cut off his hair to fulfill a vow in Acts 18, verse 18. Then they sailed across the Aegean Sea to Ephesus as a stop en route back to Syria. Something drew Paul to Ephesus, even temporarily, so he preached in the synagogues and perhaps had some converts. He was traveling with the couple Aquila and Priscilla, who would remain in Ephesus to establish the church, and later Apollos, the great expositor, would join them. Paul then sailed 1,083 miles from Ephesus for Caesarea on the Judean coast in about 6 to 7 days in a direct ship to arrive at a feast time. Paul then went up, it says, and greeted the church, likely the church in Jerusalem, according to Acts 18:22. This was probably during the feast time of the Jews. And following that, he went down to Antioch, about 360 miles north, or about a 20-day walk. Then Paul remained some time in Antioch, an undefined period, according to 1823, before beginning his return trip to Ephesus. This second journey traveled about 3,050 miles, approximately 100 days of walking, at a cost of about 314 denarii, or about $1,100 for each member of the team. Paul lived and served with the passion of one who had seen the risen Savior personally and knew Jesus was with him wherever he went, to tell the world what his Savior had accomplished on the cross and that he was still alive.